Dani, before we jump right in, can you tell me just at a high level a little bit about your background, even though I know your background, but just starting out, can you tell
Oh,
me the history of your life in a minute?
all right. Well, it definitely won't take a minute. So I think there's a couple of pieces. So right now, I'll sort of start at the end. I am what's called a product design architect at Athenahealth, and I work on our clinical's electronic health record. And that is largely a research and design strategy role. And I work closely with product management and product strategy to basically help unpack the really big problems that we see that we know we're going to have to tackle in the next few years
Mhm.
and start to dig into what is there. So that's like in a nutshell what I do. And that's probably about a minute. I think what is interesting, when you talk about me having this sort of career, my career's kind of taken a lot of twists and turns, right? So my first work experience is really centered around theater and activism. I was actually a theater major. I was an actress for about 8 years and then stopped wanting to be called fat in job interviews. I thought that was
Fair
not
enough.
a
Hmm.
good look for my life and discovered graphic design when I was working at a print shop. So I spent a lot of time working in print shops, and that sort of ended up shifting my career directory. But I also had quite a couple of years as a canvasser with a group called Clean Water Action, starting from the summer I turned 17 to in the next 2 summers.
Hmm.
And when I think about sort of the trajectory my career ended up taking, it really comes back to those two things,
Okay.
right? Because I've always been very passionate. I've always had a very strong sense of justice and not necessarily what's right and what's wrong, because I tend to see a lot of nuance in things, but what's fair and what is going to help people has always been something that I've been deeply passionate about. And then I always loved acting because it was really about digging into what makes this particular human who they are and behave the way that they're behaving right now and do
Hmm.
the thing that they're doing right now. And you need to be able to dive in like that in order to even think about how to convincingly portray someone else, right? So when I think about those two things, that sort of naturally falls into where my career has pivoted. Now, it went through a lot of twists and turns. I started as a graphic designer working in print shops and not ad agencies and marketing firms because I couldn't get myself to do that. But then I sort of got bored and decided to learn how to build websites, and then I got bored with that and decided to learn how to build in content management systems. And I like to say that every sort of twist and turn my career has taken has been directly preceded by the words fuck it, because I just sort of
Yep.
pivoted up and to the right,
Yeah,
there,
I
and
had
somehow
wondered
landed on this.
about that's so interesting, and how I did not know you had an acting background up until today. I don't know how that's
I don't
possible.
know. There's
But
everything about me that just sort of
yeah.
says that.
Well, that's one thing I was wondering in terms of your career and where it's gone. You mentioned being bored and needing to move on to something else. You also mentioned, you've gone through many different roles. And I'm wondering at this point now at Athenahealth, you and I talked about the fact that you were working as a UX manager and then you
Mhm.
did transition more into a strategist role. And I'm
Yeah.
wondering, you've gone through and worn so many hats over the years. I know there's the boredom piece, but I'm also wondering, as you've grown in your career, to what degree was it you realizing where your genius and talents are? Or could you tell me a little bit about that transition?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I've always been a little bit of a navel gazer, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so while I often joke about, the different pivots my career has taken and talked about it as boredom, a lot of times it sort of stems from this sense of being dissatisfied and having to dig in to figure out why.
Mm-hmm.
And so whenever I hit that point, I'm like, okay, what is it actually that's getting me to this point where I'm really frustrated and upset? And what do I really like about what I'm doing today? And so if I think about, as an example, the shift that I made, one of the big shifts I made was, I want to say in 2011, maybe 2012, I'd been running my own like small web studio, like a small web business. I had been embedded in the Drupal community, which is an open source content management system, for almost a decade. And I was really just frustrated by it, and I didn't know why. And so when I dug in and when I thought about it, I realized a couple of things. Like, one of the things I really loved was not coding. It was basically understanding the content and the goals and the strategy and how it all fit together, and turning that into an experience that someone was going to have. And so that made me think, okay, UX. It also made me think, well, I learned all this stuff about Drupal. I would kind of hate for that to just all sort of die with me. And in a moment of beautiful serendipity, I ended up running into an editor for O'Reilly Media, like 3 weeks later, and sold her a book on Drupal for designers, which I sort of thought is a way for me to sort of hand off,
Interesting.
about
Okay.
Drupal, right?
Yep.
I didn't think, and I probably should have, that it would make me be seen as like a Drupal expert. And then like my first jobs in UX were almost all like Drupal implementations.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But it sort of set me on the path of saying, hey, where is it I want to go? And then what do I want to leave behind once I've sort of let go of this chapter? And when I finally decided to go back to school to Bentley for user research, I was basically in the situation where, like, okay, what are the gaps that I still see between where I am now and where I want to go? So this is probably like 2013 or 2014.
Okay.
And I'm like, well, I don't know much about research, and that feels important.
Mm-hmm.
And I really feel like innovation and coming up with new stuff would be really good for me. So let's try that. And so I was able at Bentley to do my whole sort of curriculum around that. And that's sort of how I landed at a few other like places before I ultimately landed at Athena. But it really was this sort of transition from being someone who designed prototypes and UI elements and all of these other sort of, I guess, front-facing
Mm-hmm.
is of design, to being someone who was really thinking about what is the direction we should head in, what are the needs we have to fill in order to get in that direction. And so what would that mean in terms of an artifact that lays out the vision and the story for
Yep.
what this should be? And that has been a pretty reasonable part of my job since I started at Athena. It's just sort of taken different forms as I've moved through the company and sort of taken on different roles within the company.
I've wondered, thank you for all of that background and context, Dani. Another reason I'm asking you about even just the transition from management into a strategy role, I've been talking with many UX practitioners where it's been an interesting go of it over the last couple of years for many designers and researchers. And the only way to describe the discussions I've been having with these people is deciding what their next place is in the world. For some of these people, they have management positions, they're still in-house or they're in a strategy position. But like you, they're trying to figure out in previous incarnations of your career, what's next. And to share a little bit just with you, I don't think I've ever shared this with you. The transition from management for me back into a strategic practitioner role, it was a little tough. And what I mean by that is that throughout my career, so I was operating at a senior director level, managing designers and researchers. And I believed that's where my career should take me. As I continued down that path, I realized that was not where I wanted to take my career. And there were some angsty moments for me making the shift to, you know what I love and what I'm best at, even though I can manage people, what I love is the research and the strategy and driving decisions in an organization. But it took me, when I've been talking with other UX leaders and practitioners, it took me a couple of years, honestly, to let go of the belief that, this management track is the way to go. And I'm wondering, it sounds like it may not have been a couple years for you, but you were on the management track. And I'm wondering, was
Yeah.
it at all angsty for you, or what
Um,
led to the shift?
Also possibly at a different, I mean, I think, I mean, there's so many layers here, right?
Yeah.
Because part of what the industry has really taught you, and I think that this is, capitalism in a nutshell, right? Is like until you manage people, you're not like a success, right? Even the title individual contributor just feels so demeaning sometimes, even though a lot of individual contributors basically think of manager as a, but anyway, we'll pin that somewhere else. I think I felt like I kept failing as a manager. I don't know that my directs would agree. Like I don't know that my directs felt that way, but I felt like in both of my management positions, and I had two of them, one at Athena, one at Pegasystems, the company I was at before Athena. In both of them, I was trying to build a team, trying to help them navigate very, very complex environments. And it swallowed so much of my energy and my mental capacity and my emotional capacity that the other half of my job, which was like, where is this whole thing going? The stuff that I really love, just I did not have the bandwidth for that.
Mhm.
Right. And so it felt like there were a lot of days where I just felt like I'm not good at this. I'm so bad at this. Why am I doing this? And feeling like, well, wait a minute, this is where my career is supposed to go, right? Like there's only so far you can go up until, you do the thing. And I had to give a lot of credit to my manager at Athena, who has now since left, or my former manager at Athena, I should say, for like clocking that almost immediately, or like clocking it probably a year after I was like, this is just too much. And I kept resisting.
Yep.
And finally, he was looking for this design architect role. And I think in retrospect, I have this story in my head that he was intentionally bringing in just absolutely ludicrous candidates for this role because like he had me as
So you
part
would
of
be like, this is
yeah,
me.
like who is this clown? And like and so like so this is like the story in my head. It is probably entirely untrue, but it's fun to think about. But yeah, like he was looking for people external. A lot of the people just were not even close to a fit, and he knew how frustrated I was. So he had been hinting to me for like months. It's like, it's not the only option what you're doing right now. And so finally, like it took this one sort of big come to Jesus moment where there was this just massive conflict between me and some of the other folks that I was working with for me to finally say, you know what? Yeah, fuck it. Let's talk.
Yeah, it's, we all have different stories and configurations and what happened to make our transitions. You are mentioning something that I think about a lot. Sometimes it takes one of those moments, the conflict you were having, like a moment of pain to
Oh,
lead to
such
the
pain.
decision. Well, to
Such pain.
grow. Sometimes we're done with
Yeah.
the pain. Okay, I need to dig in on something. So I like to think of it as seasoned. We're seasoned, but we've been
Mhm.
in the UX product world for 20 plus years, both of us. And I know you're in your design architect role, a design strategist role. When I'm talking with different organizations, and this is admittedly for me, Dani, when I try to describe who I am, sometimes I'm saying I'm a product strategist, sometimes I'm saying I'm a UX strategist or a design strategist. At Athena, you are a design architect and design
Yeah.
strategist, but you had also mentioned to me that Athena has product strategists. First off, what is your role as a design architect? You touched upon this a little bit, getting into the meaty, complex problems, but what's
Mhm.
your role as a design architect versus the product strategists in-house?
So a lot of times it can sometimes change depending on the needs of the business or where we are at the time. Actually, it quite often changes. So like there's some aspect of my work that's just like research this vague area that we know is a problem, but we don't know exactly what the problem is yet, right? So an example of this was configuring the EHR,
And an
right?
EHR, which I know
Electronic
now,
health.
electronic health record. Yep.
Configuring the EHR and sort of the
Okay.
link between needing to configure or how complex it is to configure a feature and actually adopt, like people actually adopting that feature. So that sort of ended up spiraling into a bunch of different things, which ultimately came into this idea of like, okay, well, if we had sort of an optimal setup for Athena One for a client or for a given specialty, what would that look like? And so that started becoming part of my research, right?
Okay.
I started researching and we decided we wanted to go into these different specialty markets, like women's health and behavioral health. And like, what does that look like? What is it they're trying to do today? What are they unable to do? And what does that mean for what we end up having to do in Athena One? Right. So there's all of these different sort of rabbit holes that I get to sort of go down. They're usually driven by things that are coming up at the sort of product strategy level and sort of product leadership level, right? And so we might end up deciding we're going to do a strategic initiative to start incorporating external and interoperable data at the point of care. Okay, well, what does that even look like? Where does it start? Where does the data come from? Where does it go to? What's in the data? Same thing with like the sort of configuration piece. Well, a lot of EHR configuration is actually content, right? It's your
Yep.
templates. It's how you sort of document and accelerate documentation. And so a lot of it is really content management. And so that becomes opportunities, right? So a lot of what I end up doing is taking these sort of vague directives that are sort of loosely defined, not that they're undefined, but they're sort of loosely defined by product or product strategy, and then working with them to add some shape to it
Mhm.
and say, okay, let's say where we're going to go after this. Like, what do we need to learn in order to know that this is what we're going to go after, to know what we have to go after, what we would need to actually do to like make sure these folks are happy. And so it provides a different layer, I think, to the work that product strategy has to do, because a lot of times, the information that product strategy often has at their disposal, and same thing with product management, is things like voice of the customer, like market research, like surveys, what our competitors are doing, right? None of those are bad things. Like they're very important aspects of the puzzle. What can sometimes be lacking is that nuanced understanding of what the humans are trying to achieve.
Mhm.
We're ultimately going to use this thing,
Yep.
right? And so that's the piece that I get to bring. And so when we bring that together, and say, okay, this is what the humans are trying to achieve. They can't achieve it for this reason. That means we need to build X. And then product strategy can bring some shape to that and say, if we build that X, we will see X impact
Yep.
in
Yep.
whatever metric we're at. And
Yep.
like, what are the success outcomes? What are the success metrics? What are the resources we're going to need if we're going to actually build this?
Mhm. What you're
Right. So,
describing too, Dani, and I've had a lot of discussions about like what's the difference between strategic foundational discovery research versus more of the tactical evaluative validation research. And I'm wondering, in your role, it sounds like you're doing a lot of that. Okay, we have this vague problem space. Dani, figure out what's happening with the humans. And you're brought in so early in the process to start understanding that. Is that correct? That you're brought
yeah.
in,
And a lot of
hopefully you're
what it
brought
ends
in
up
early?
Yeah, and I mean, a lot of what it ends up being, and the way that it's sort of shaped up over the last couple of years, and one of the reasons I love working with product on this stuff is because, I'm very blessed at Athena that we have a lot of resources available to the UX team. We actually have a very robust and thoughtful UX team and UX process. And, we have product managers and engineers here who actually love sitting in on client interviews.
Mhm.
And they love, watching, going on site visits and watching people do their jobs. And so there's a lot of like camaraderie, even if there is the occasional conflict and trade-off.
You
But
you anticipated for me. Sorry, you can't see
no
I'm
worries.
feverishly taking notes. I'm just excited to talk about, you touched upon, I'm wondering, I'm a wonky researcher, and I'm wondering, when you're doing your strategic research to understand the problem space, you mentioned client interviews, site
Yeah.
visits, like, do you have, and I'm sure it depends, but like, what are your go-to methods, and how are you
Oh my
involving your
goodness.
team members?
Oh my God. So give me a moment to finish my original thought.
Nope.
And then I shall go to that. The things that I like, so I'm very blessed to have this sort of like relative, pretty supportive environment generally. And I've been there long enough that I've got some clout, I guess, in the organization, right? I think the distinction that I've been making recently is that a lot of what I'm bringing to the table that can be very different than your pure generative or evaluative research is two pieces. One, a framework for how to think about the space. A lot of what I do is like figure out those, 1 to 3 PowerPoint slides that are just going to help you figure out what the heck we're talking about or how to sort of talk about this problem space. And that comes from an incredibly nuanced understanding of all the different sort of places here. The other piece is that I am really, really, really invested in making things practical and getting to that point of like, okay, we know what the problems are. What's our thought around a solution? What could this look like? And now how do we test our idea of what this could look like to make sure that, people sort of understand it, help us refine it so that by the time we get to the point where we either are getting ready to build something or getting ready to invest in something, we have a really solid baseline to start from, right? A lot of times when I see folks talking about, research insight, and I did so much of this, honestly, when I was working at the user experience center at Bentley, you give them sort of this list of things you found and hope for the best.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes, like, I've seen generative decks where the vision has almost no detail to it, like almost no sort of understanding of like where this could go, how someone could practically use it. I've seen like design principles that are like actionable, timely, like, yeah, of course, I want to get this stuff at the right time. Like, how is this new information to me? Right. So I always strive to put a bit more, I guess, nuance on things like, and I always go back to this thing my mom likes to say whenever I say something she doesn't understand, which is quite often because, I work in tech and she does not. What does that mean when it's at home? Like I'm always looking for that. Okay, what does this mean when it's at home? What would this mean if this was really a thing in the world? In terms of techniques and sort of methods, and I'm going to get to Vesna's, and hopefully Vesna, that's your name, or that's how to pronounce your name, sorry. I'm going to get to that question in a moment. But in terms of like the things that I tend to bring into the role, you're right. A lot of things sort of depend on what it is that we're looking at. I always like to start with a really thorough understanding of the work people are trying to do in this problem space and what steps they have to take to do it. What that can look like if it's based on something that the system already does is I'm meeting with internal subject matter experts to get an understanding of like how we handle this stuff for our clients or how, how these things happen. Or it's actually going into Athena 1 and trying to mock up like, okay, trying to sort of work my way through how someone would do this particular task and like screenshotting it. And so I can sort of imagine almost like a cognitive walkthrough if you're obviously familiar with those. So that usually starts with that. It's just like I need a grounding in this space. Like, what is all the stuff that's here? And it also involves like just diving into as much as I can, not just stuff we've already done, like research we've already done, but like industry research. I've just started playing with an internal version of ChatGPT where I can ask it. Like today, I think I was asking, like, tell me what you know about ambient generation of clinical notes.
I know you have more to say here, and I don't want
Yeah.
to take you off the path, Dani, to Vesna's question and mine, and feel
Yeah.
free to table it
Go
until
for
you're
it. No,
ready.
no, no.
I've
Please.
been thinking
Let's get
about
into
how
that.
you were talking about you're so well established at Athena, and Vesna was touching on this too. Like you're established, and you mentioned your years at Athena, but there's so
Yeah.
much more to it than that in terms of how you got a seat at the
Oh, yeah.
table, how you influence. And to Vesna's point, looking at, thank you for the question, Vesna, like how did you get product on board to see like the value in this approach? Like I know it's so much more beyond your time there. It's just how do you strategically first
Yeah.
partner with product management to get their buy-in starting early, but there's also leadership. How did you
Yeah.
can you share your insights there for us?
Yeah. I mean, some things are going to sound really boring, right? Like, some things are going to sound really boring. I don't give people an option. I sit at the table. Like
Does
that's
that work though? See,
for me, yeah. I
I'm
can't say
always
it works
one
for
for
everybody.
team-based collaboration and
No.
develop your
Um,
strong
but I
relationships.
think that, but see, this is an important point though, right? Because team-based, collaborative, right? That's what I mean when I say I sit at the table, right? For me, what I found, and I think this was something that really kind of, because I fell into this trap for a while that I think we all get into, which is like, you've got to convince them. You've got to like, you've got to sort of like get a seat at the table and be in all the meetings and stuff. And so like a lot of my approach has been, I want to like sort of like grounding myself in two things. One, the stuff I want to do is way too big and way too interesting to do on my own. It needs to involve other people, and involving other people is only going to make that better. And so I started to adapt this approach, like to adopt this approach of like, hey, I need to tap your brilliance. Can I bug you for a minute? I need to get your perspective on this because I know there's something I'm missing. Can you look at this and tell me what it is? The other piece is I do, and sometimes this works better, sometimes it doesn't work as well. Like I just tend to assume I'm at the table and talk to people that way, right? I am very direct, but I'm also very inquisitive. And I find that piece of like, I used to be that kind of person who sort of like walks into a place, starts running her mouth, but doesn't have the perspective of what we've tried before, any of the organizational like pieces. And that used to backfire on me all the time. Right. And like when you walk in with that mentality of, I need to convince people to give me a seat at the table, like it sort of changes how you interact, I have found.
Absolutely, absolutely. You're speaking
And
to, I don't think a lot of UX leaders describe it this way, but that you're speaking to what you've learned through your experiences. You know your value, you know
mhm,
your worth, you know your expertise and lessons learned, and you
yeah,
bring that authentic identity to your work, right? Like you have
yeah,
a seat at the table.
exactly. And I think the other side to that coin, which I think is incredibly important in one area where I really think we as a community, especially UX leaders, really need to step up our game, is I work real hard to learn other people's value and what they bring to the table and to tap that brilliance to improve the work we're doing together. Right. And I don't think this really clicked for me until I started collaborating really directly with product strategy and with product management. which is something that like really kind of kicked off when I started working with Athena. Like Athena was it was sort of a mind blown for me, if I'm honest, because like I had been enmeshed in that world of like, oh, UX and product don't get each other and like all this other stuff. And so that was like, there was some unlearning I had to do.
Mhm.
Right. And and so I think that's the piece where I just really have found my approach has improved, and that's led to a lot more success. So I don't
Yeah.
think it's exclusively Athena and just our culture here, although I know that that contributes to it.
Mhm.
But it is very much like me being able to approach people from like, help me tap your brilliance, help
Mhm.
me get your contribution to this, because
Yep.
that's going to get better.
It's making you think back quite a bit, but back to you have achieved strategic influence and and strong partnerships, and you're 5 years in at Athena, is that right?
I just did six, yeah.
Okay,
So
wow,
yeah,
congratulations.
so I
Well,
just passed my 6 year anniversary,
mhm.
and my daughter turned 7 yesterday.
Oh, happy
So
birthday.
my
That's
youngest, not my oldest.
major achievements. Well, and I'd love you to call me on this, Dani, and let me know if you agree or disagree or yes, but when I'm talking with UX leaders, if you're thinking back to your first 90 days at Athena,
Yeah.
what I recommend based on
Mhm.
I've made a lot of mistakes in my career where I came in and I was coming from a consultant background thinking I knew everything and I just got going with the work. And what I
Yeah.
recommend now in those first 90 days, and I'm curious what your approach was, that the UX leaders, rather than starting with, hey, this is what we need to do, go on a listening tour across the organization to get a sense of what the marketing team's needs are, what's finance talking about, like understanding the business model across the board, talking to key stakeholders. And sure, there's some small wins you want during those first 90 days, but when you think back, were you focusing on establishing those relationships at first? Like, I took the approach of a listening tour, or were you less formal about it?
So, well, I'm usually less formal about everything.
And I'm very
Not formal at all, as noted by the number of F-bombs I've already dropped. Um, I think so this is a little bit of like lessons learned for me, I think, because when I went to Pegasystems, I was brought in as like a voice of expertise. I was brought in to sort of build a UX function. And it wasn't going to be, I don't think it was ever going to be like a huge UX function, but it was like meant to support the digital team, which at the time was mostly marketing, but also training. And the ways in which my manager, the person who hired me, and myself sort of, I don't think we set me or the UX function up for success. And part of that was we had sort of like adopted this approach of like, well, Dani knows what she's doing. She's written books about Drupal. Everyone should listen to her and like all of this other stuff. And it just turned into a very sort of toxic, combative environment,
Yeah,
almost
I was
from
going to say, I'm sure that went over well with your colleagues.
exactly like it really. And so there were certain ways in which like I was very unequivocal, I did get some wins right away. I was seen as respected. Also, bridges ended up being burned just because of the way that the whole group was doing business, but also the way that I was doing business and all of the things that I was seeing around me. So when I got to Athena, or when I finally like left Pega, I was like, I want to be at a place where I don't have to teach you that UX is a thing. I want you to just know it, right? I want you to know it. I want you to be here and with me, and like we sort of together know, and we can figure out like the nuances of it, but generally we know this is a thing. And I very much found that when I interviewed at Athena. And so I'm like, all right, cool. Yeah, this is it. And it gave me the ability, like it wasn't a just research or just design, which was another piece that was really important to me. And I still had sort of a leadership role, but I didn't have to manage, which was good because I was burned out by managing. And through all of the pieces, like, I think that the thing that really set me up for success, and I actually have to credit my manager in Collector, Brian Manning, who's still one of the best UX managers I've ever worked for. If I had any interest in billing, I would love to work for him again, but I prefer the clinical side. He was the one who like set me up with a list of people to talk to and said, here are the one-on-ones you should have. And I started scheduling one-on-ones with like my product lead, my engineering lead, the two designers who were working in my zone, the other design managers. And so, yeah, like, I mean, it wasn't sort of a formal listening tour, but like, it was really about sort of the thing I wanted to do differently this time was I wanted to understand the humans that I was working with, and I wanted to understand the dynamics of the different teams. And I wanted to understand like the problem spaces that we were focused on. And I wanted to do that before I started running my mouth.
Yep, absolutely. You touched upon something, and before I keep grilling you, Dani,
Because
I
I'm going
did
to
want
run my
to
mouth.
encourage anyone who's listening in, feel free to put questions in the chat window. We have about 15 more minutes, and I have an hour and a half of questions for Dani, but this is about the questions you have. So if you do have any questions, please put them in the chat window, and we'll ask Dani. Okay, I have a question. It's a question, well, it's not near and dear to my heart, but I'm passionate about. You were talking about vetting Athena when you were going in for the interview process to make sure this was an organization where you could be successful. I don't want to lead the witness. I have some thoughts in terms of how you vet an organization to determine whether you can succeed. When you were coming in and talking to the hiring manager and the leadership, what were you asking, and what made you realize, oh, this is a place where UX as a practice can succeed? Like, how do you vet an organization to make sure that it's equipped for UX and supports UX?
So I think there's a couple of things that I tend to look for. One of which, and this is something I don't think I learned about myself until maybe the last couple of years. I was diagnosed 2 years ago with ADHD, which is something that I am pretty sure that I've known I had since my late 20s, and have definitely, like, I can sort of pinpoint all the points in my life where, yeah, that was ADHD. But one of the things that means is if I cannot be interested in the subject matter, I cannot do the job. I literally cannot. My brain will fight me to not do the job. This is one of the reasons I realized I could just never work in marketing or advertising, and I can't work in e-commerce because like no interest whatsoever. So that's sort of one aspect, is like, is the subject matter we're talking about remotely interesting to me? The other piece, and I think Athena did a great job at this in the interview process, although we do unfortunately have those like 4-hour half-day interview things, which just are exhausting, and I don't know why anyone does them. But I was able to meet enough variety of people that I got a sense of how all of these pieces fit together. And in particular, they're very thoughtful about making sure that you, for example, meet your product and engineering partners, or at least someone on the product and engineering side up front, so you can ask them questions, talk about how projects work, like talk to me about like the release process and all this other stuff. And those people are also in your portfolio review. So when you're doing like a portfolio presentation, I got to hear like the questions that the product people were asking. And some of our product people ask amazing questions, right? Some of our engineers ask amazing questions. And one of the things that I picked up on in those sort of discussions, and I see it all the time when I see, go see people go through the interview cycle now, is they'll ask questions like, what is the problem you're dealing with here, right? Like, what's the problem you're trying to solve? Who are you trying to solve it for, right? What are some of the challenges you came up with in trying to implement this thing, and how did you deal with those, right? And so they're asking the right questions. And they're also not asking in such a way that it makes you feel like you have to fight to be at the table. It feels like, one of my favorite things in the world, I love an engineer who appreciates UX. I love it, love it, love it. And we have a ton of them here. And that was like the revelation for me, is like there's actually like engineers here that I can like bug when I don't know how something works. There are product people who are like explicitly looking to understand how people think about this stuff. Like,
Mhm.
holy hell.
Absolutely. So I don't know if you'll agree or disagree, because I'm taking note and it's really, really helpful. Again, it's not you having to control the situation during the interview
No,
process and
no, it's
grilling the
literally I'm
stakeholders.
looking for
Well,
things.
yeah, well, where
Yeah,
you
I'm
said through the
noticing things.
process, they asked the right questions, they're focusing on the problem space. The culture as it was already was team-based and collaborative. You're talking with your
Mhm.
engineering and product partners, so you get to observe the culture. So I don't know if you'll agree with this or not. There's one element of a culture that I've been talking a lot about, and I want to get your take in terms of how Athena operates. So this is a lens from research work where I come in, I assess the landscape, I meet the stakeholders, I partner, we talk about the problems, and we run as a group foundational strategic research when I come in. And sometimes that research drives decisions across the board.
Yep.
The organization is making evidence-based decisions at the top level all the way down. And sometimes in the history of my career, the research sat. And
Hmm.
one thing, my methods did not change and the team's approach did not change. I've been in situations, Dani, where like at Athena, there's team-based collaborative approaches, people understand the problems, but when there isn't someone at the top level, at the C level, who
Mm.
also is a huge proponent of making evidence-based decisions, my hypothesis is that's when things can fall flat. And I'm wondering what your take on that is. One hypothesis I have is if the culture is as it is, as you've described it, Athena, there have to be people at the C level that operate that way, right? Like,
I would say so. I mean, I think, it is one of those interesting, I think it's one of those interesting discussions, because a lot of times when we as like UX as an industry talk about this, you probably remember like the trend of the chief design officer. And oh no, you got to be at the C-suite in order to do a damn thing, and
yeah.
like I've never fully believed in that, because you can
Mhm.
have a chief design officer, or you could have like, there's a lot of people who are like entitle only, right? And we had a chief design officer. He was great, right? Scott, who ended up leaving to join Indigo Agriculture, and he was great. But like once he left, UX moved under product, right, and under the chief product officer. And you know what? That transition has been totally fine,
Mhm.
right? And the reason that transition has been totally fine is because of two, I think, fundamental things. One, our chief product officer, Paul Bryant, is just a huge component, a huge proponent of user experience, right? Same thing with our VP of product and clinicals. And I would say like most of our VPs of product, huge proponent of user experience, delighting our users, like all that stuff. The other piece is the culture already existed, right? And like I've seen this at a number of organizations. You can have as many people who are promoting this at the tippity top as you want. If the other pieces of the chain are not on board, they're not going to be on board. Right. So,
Agreed. Yep.
it is one of those things where like I think one of the things that Scott, when we did have a chief design officer, and there were so many other people, by the way, I don't want to like, put him on a pedestal, but I think one of the things that him and the group that he brought in before I even joined, one of the things they really did was just change the way design happened at Athena, right? And that was a really big change, and it set the foundation for the company I was able to join. And I will never not be grateful for that, right? But I do think you hit a point where the question is, do you really need like this one figurehead at the top who represents design?
Yeah.
Or is it really more about having the people through all levels of the organization that really understand the importance of what we're doing, the importance of understanding what human beings are trying to get done before doing work for them?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely,
Right?
Dani. Thank you. And it's so funny when I talk with people about this, there is sometimes the leap to me thinking of having a chief design officer at the table.
Mhm.
I hear you. That's not my take that it has to be a chief
Yeah.
design officer. You need to have people at the C level. And you said this, the product leaders, the
Mhm.
CFO, the CEO. It doesn't matter,
Yeah.
CMO. But to your point, it doesn't go just one way. It's not having the going from the top down. It has to go
Yeah.
both ways. Everyone in the organization really needs to focus on design and UX and have a culture focused on it.
Yeah.
Yep.
Exactly.
Yep. Okay, we have 5 minutes. Vesna, feel free to chat and add any questions.
Yeah.
This is this is not something we talked about, but I'm just curious, Dani, in terms of you saying you've had mentors and coaches and people you've worked with who have strategically set up organizations for, leading to design success and UX success and organizational change. That doesn't happen overnight. That's a strategic game
Mhm.
plan that happens over time. Quick question, like in your career and people you're following who are doing great work in the product and UX space, are there people you turn to right now for advice as you're moving forward in your career? Are there people you follow or are there things
So,
you're reading?
yeah, I mean, so I think a lot of the stuff that I've been reading most recently, I gotta be honest, a lot of the stuff that I have been reading has been like fiction
Mhm.
and like self-help. Like there's a book called, what is it? Don't Tell Me to Calm Down. It's
Oh,
about sort of making friends with your anger and trying to get to understand what it's happening to, what's happening to you. I think a lot about like emotional intelligence and emotional regulation, because that's sort of one of the challenges that happens with ADHD is your emotional regulation center is like way off. So I think a lot about that because a lot of times emotional intelligence is confused with stoicism. But then the other thing I've been really loving is like reading fiction. So, and listening to fiction. So I just finished a book called Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver, which is like one of the most amazing books I've ever read because it tells the story of this young Melungeon boy from Appalachia and sort of overlays his life story with the opioid epidemic, like the rise and sort of crest of the opioid epidemic in the 90s and
Vesna
like
said, amazing book.
the ways in which Appalachia tends to be forgotten and ignored and has really been sort of screwed over for generations after generations, right?
Hmm.
And so, like, even though this is fiction, it's like such a deeply human story. It still has that sort of clinical background. I also really love medical history. There's a book on, I think it's called Chico's Women. It's about the story of hysteria as like a medical
Oh.
diagnosis and the way that it was treated, like back in the 18 and 1900s. There's another one I love called Fear of the Black Body by Dr. Sabrina Stringer that makes the link like very, very clear between anti-fat bias and racism and slavery and the ways in which like white people dealt with the cognitive dissonance of owning humans by trying to separate themselves in any way possible. And one of the ways that they did that was basically by saying, well, look, Black people have these sort of more lascivious bodies, and so they are obviously morally corrupt. And so we, white people, need to have very thin bodies to show that we are morally superior, right? And so, like, those are the books that I tend to lean on to inform my approach to my work.
Yep, yep. Thank you.
Right?
Thank you.
Yeah, like I've gotten a lot less into sort of design
Hmm.
influencers over the last
Hmm.
like 50 years. I'm
Absolutely.
just tired since I hit perimenopause.
Yep. And final question and
Yes.
challenging question. I don't know how I'd answer this, but I'll ask it and you can pass if you want. But if you
Okay.
were to go back 15 years and you could talk to yourself 15 years ago, given your career, professional, personal life, what is the one piece of advice you'd give yourself from 15 years back that you've learned?
Where was I 15 years ago?
Arbitrary number too.
So I don't know that I would go, so I don't even remember where I was 15 years ago.
Yeah.
I think if I sort of look back at who I was and who I am today, I think one of the things, and this is going to sound very snarky, I would have gone on psych meds much sooner. And I made a lot of missteps in my 20s because I was a woman with ADHD. And there were a lot of things that just tripped me up about having to be an adult with a job and that kind of thing. And I believed for a very long time, one of the reasons I started my own business was because I genuinely believed I couldn't work for other people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it was just, and when I look back, I realized that a lot of it had to do with the fact that I couldn't focus myself on work that didn't interest me in some way. And I can't I can't witness bullshit without having to call it out.
Yep. Yep. Thank you for your candor and everything you were sharing throughout this session. I learned a lot. I didn't share with this with you, but as I was thinking about who I wanted to connect with, I thought about knowing you for so long. I've so admired your strength, your brilliance, your perseverance, and just your integrity and honesty to everything you do, both personally
Even
and
if that gets me in
professionally.
trouble,
Well,
which it
that's why,
often does.
I wanted to talk to you about your professional experience. But as I mentioned, selfishly, I want to talk with people who operate in all parts of their life in ways that I respect. So thank you, Dani. This was excellent.